All right, welcome, man. This is the first slide, the first presentation of your AIS experience, right? Hey, so welcome. Glad to kind of get started. What you're going to see is an overview, but here's also what you're going to see in these PowerPoints is won't be much different than me in class. Okay, meaning I'm not going off a script. I'm just talking, right? I'm just kind of going through the process of telling you the topics. Hopefully you've already done is read the chapter or using this kind of as an outline so you can go ahead and from here read the chapters. Okay, so that's really what we'll be doing. So welcome. Right, let's get started. Okay, now this really is an overview. Okay, the whole semester and the whole topics. This is a different accounting class. You're not working problems. It's not that type of class. There's a lot of information though you need to know. I talk about this, like I said, and this gives you an idea of what I'm like in class. But a couple of little things I always talk about. We as accountants, we have to know a little bit about everything. Okay, and so in this system overview, that's that opportunity. Okay, so we've got to know. You've got to know. I've got to know. And what shouldn't surprise you, and what you'll hopefully figure out is we do know a little bit about everything, right? We'll talk about the business as we kind of go through the semester, and we'll figure this thing out. Okay. All right. Now, what I do want to do is I will always point out the objectives. Sometimes in the past I kind of fly through these because you've read them, but I always want to touch base on these, especially in this class, because this is unusual for us, right? We're good with financial accounting. We've done intermediate one, intermediate. Well, you haven't done them all yet. And your principles class. If you go to the masters, you're going to ultimately take an advanced accounting class, all right, kind of like a third intermediate. You've done cost, okay. Even when you get into your tax classes, you'll be used to working problems to some extent. But in here, we're not. Now, we'll get a little bit of data analytics and stuff, but there's information. And so I want you to make sure you're comfortable with what that looks like, all right? So we're going to talk about the difference between data and information, okay? Another objective is we've got to understand the decisions of the organization. And you'll hear this a lot this semester from me. I taught cost for a long time. This is actually the second semester for me teaching systems. Changed the book a little bit and the topic, so I think this one will be very informative for you and something you'll take away with you. But when I had cost, if I could, and we do it at the grad level, I'd change the name of the class to what? Accounting for Decision Makers, okay? Because that's really what we're doing. And we'll find here we're going to be making some decisions. We'll talk about data analytics a little bit later in the semester, all right? And then how the AI system, right, adds value. And so those are the things that we'll be looking at. Now, so what is a system? If you can think about it, right? Even if I think of the College of Business, for instance, right? Detailed method, procedures, routines, carry out of specific activities. But if I think about the College of Business, all right, a subset of that would be the accounting department. And so we've got a system. And what is that system, right? We let students in, right? You go through, you qualify to college, then into the college, then you declare a major, you go through classes. There's some other things that you'll ultimately do. All right, you go to meet the firm's events, you're looking for a job, and that's ultimately kind of the ultimate outcome. But there's a system. And it's the same way when you registered with classes or, how you bought the textbook, right? You went through the system that you went through. And so we've got to find out and understand a little bit more about that. All right. And you're going to hear me say this all semester. We're going to talk about some things that are related to accounting. And you're probably going to think, well, that's not accounting. That's management or somewhere else. But remember, right, we always said this, accounting is what? The language of business. And so you've got to make sure by the end of the semester, you recognize, hey, we have to understand how this system works. All right. And we'll talk about a little bit of that in a minute when we talk about the difference between data and information, okay? So now we're looking at this organization, and I know y'all will talk about this in management classes and OB and stuff like that, but there's two things that we're trying to do. And as we put our system in place, organizations design them around their goals, okay? Goal conflict is when I'm looking out for myself. And so to get for instance, the accounting department, all right, I'm trying to get as many students as I can, and so is marketing or management or finance. All right. And so if my goal is when I go to take students from one to here, right, we're really robbing Peter to pay Paul. The goal congruence, though, from the College of Business level is going to be, hey, we want the students in, we want you to find your major, what's the best fit for you, right? And so businesses operate the exact same way. And those are the two things we need to know, especially as we talk about designing these systems. And that's what we're going to be doing. We got to make sure that we don't have this goal conflict, and we want the congruence piece, right? We want everybody on the same page. So what's the difference? And this becomes important, right? Because data and information, you don't have information without the data. And we want to make sure that we understand the difference, okay? Because while this isn't a technical class, we are going to talk about databases. We are going to talk about computer systems. We're going to understand how that information is, because at the end of the day, we need to make sure that the data that goes into the system and the information that comes out, right? Data is going to go in, information is going to come out. We got to make sure that that information is what? Relevant and reliable. We'll talk about those characteristics in a minute. But it's just like here in a database system, there's information. There's a date. There's a company, ABC company. We don't know, is that a vendor or is that a client? Okay. And here's some numbers. And that's the way the numbers are inside of a database management. Well, we've got to make sure that we take those numbers and turn them into information, right? And so we create this invoice, and we categorize what these dates are going to be, where these numbers, right? And so now what have we got? We've got meaningful information. Listen, when I talk about the data and information, something else I want you to recognize is a lot of what we're going to do this semester, you're probably somewhat familiar with it. You've heard it. The context might be a little bit different. And so what you want to make sure is say, hey, if I've already heard that or that's come up before, right? When you hear something more than once is what? It's important. And what you really like to do, especially by the time the semester's over, but even at the end of videos and stuff, is you want to have heard something, you go, oh, well, I already knew that. Or I didn't need to hear that. I'll say this, and whether you're an intermediate or cost, or right, if you can go to a class and you can walk out and say that was a waste of time, that's really valuable. All right. And let me tell you why. Because what you're saying is, hey, I already knew that. Well, then that's just a reinforcement that, hey, I'm getting comfortable, that I'm going to understand this. And, it's the information and things that you learn that you take with you from class to class. All right. And so this is kind of the same information in the book. I found this slide somewhere, and I just kind of liked it. It looked to me as a good idea of the difference between data, raw, unprocessed. All right, we process it and give it some meaning. All right, this is the basis for analysis, and then we've got to do what? We've got to analyze it, right? We've got to turn it into something so we can make those decisions, something to support the story I'm going. Right, we're not good at analytical, anecdotal evidence. I don't want anecdotal evidence. If you're my staff and you're working for me, right? I need you to support the facts, right? You've all done it. Don't tell your parents, well, they said, because I'm going to come back and ask you, who's they? And I'm going to do that in this class. Okay, you're going to tell me some things. I'm not interested who they are. You tell me who they are, right? Back it up. And that's what we're going to be able to do. All right. Value, what that looks like. We're going to talk a little bit about value. All right. Just numbers and dates, but we got to get them in. And that's what you should already know about data and information. All right. So let's think about 14 characteristics. Now, if I set you down today and, some of you are new, this might be your first class. You might be taking it with intermediate one, and even at the grad level, it's still an intermediate one, a systems, right? The three core classes for those that are in the grad is systems, cost, and intermediate one. Everybody in undergrad, your first three classes are what? Cost, systems, and intermediate one, all right? Sometimes you've already had cost with systems, but you don't have to. We're going to do some costs, though. We're going to talk a little bit about it, because why? What did I tell you? I would call it accounting for decision making. Okay. All right. And so if I asked you to tell me, what do you think makes information useful? You could probably come up with, of the 14, you could come up with 10 of them. 10 or 12. Now, you might not word them the exact same way, and I'm okay with that. Um, there's actually a problem at the end of the chapter. I think it's problem 1.4 that gives you definitions and it gives you characteristics. I didn't assign that one, and that's pretty good here. But another example. Let's just say we're trying to issue somebody credit. All right, you're going to you're going to buy a car, right? You got to get a loan. Well, think about the information that's useful. Okay, some of these characteristics, if we can apply it to that, I'll talk through them, but access restricted. All right. So for instance, then if you're going in and you're trying to get my credit report, that's not going to be available to everybody, right? We've got to restrict the access to that information. But I do know this, it better be accurate. Okay. It's got to be available when it's needed. So I've got to be able to access it. Reputable. All right. True and credible. And credible. There's two that going to always pop up, and I don't know if they use the words all the time, but relevant and reliable. Okay, because it's got to be those two. Those are terms you'll hear throughout accounting forever. All right, relevant and reliable. All right, complete. Right. If I'm doing that credit, I don't need something missed. I don't need one of your bankruptcies or bad debts not to be included. All right. I don't need, and we'll talk about information overload. I need it concise and clear and consistent, right? I'm working in this area, and time again, I go to pull up the reports. They all need to look the same. And what else? Current, up to date, makes sense, right? That it's not useful if it's not current. Now, this is always going to be interesting, and I talk about this a lot in my ethics class. But we are all biased, right? We bring biases in. We just have to recognize that. To me, as an accountant, this is critical. I talk about this in grad and with my CPAs and stuff, but we have to be objective, okay? We have to be objective in everything we do as accountants. Information has to be objective. Then you allow the one that obtains that information to what? They make the decision, but we don't want the information that we provide to send you in one of those areas based on biases that sometimes data has, right? Relevant. Remember I told you that, relevant and reliable. Information can be great, right? Sometimes I get some really good information from a lot of different places, but it's not relevant to the decision I'm making. So the key, and for you guys, I always like to tell you this too, is at the end of the day, all of y'all are going to graduate with really the same knowledge. Okay. All right. Same grades. You grade the knowledge. Your grades might be a little bit different. All right. Some of you might not, but at the end of the day, you've all got the same amount of knowledge. And so you got to make sure though that you understand the information that's relevant. Okay. And your ability to pull that out is what's going to set you apart. Not the technical skills. Everybody's going to have it. Everybody's going to be able to do tax returns or, depending on the area, or prepare financial statements or do a bank reconciliation. But it's actually knowing what the company needs of all that information, what's relevant. Okay. Timely. It's not going to do me any good, right? I'm applying for that loan now. It's not going to do me good 2 months from now. Usable, understandable, verifiable. Okay. So if two different people, will they produce the same information? That's also important. All right. Now that might not happen in the decision making, but the information that we're providing, we got to know those two differences, right? The difference between data and the difference between information, because what we worry about is this information overload. You'll hear this a couple of times, even in this presentation, is just making sure we don't want too much information. One of the things that I always hear when I go out and do my consulting stuff is companies sometimes struggle with managers just having a difficult time to make a decision. They've got all the information there, but sometimes they just have too much information and it becomes hard for them to make decisions. Now, two other kinds of information, also talk about it as accountants, right? We'll serve in a couple of roles. One of the roles is we're preparing reports that are mandatory, okay? Tax returns, annual reports. But the discretionary piece, that's really cost accounting. Everybody that's accounting in cost, that accounting for decision making, you're preparing a lot of stuff that's discretionary. All right. And so we've got to understand what that is. The discretionary piece, is hopefully doing what? adding value. Okay. The mandatory piece, yeah, I don't know if it's always adding value, except it's required and it has to be done. So what you'll see sometimes is managers are trying to minimize the cost. Um, we'll talk a lot about cost benefit and things of that nature, but we've got to be careful because, and I talk about this. Remember, if you're going into public accounting, right? I know most of y'all are just now getting started and you don't really know what kind of area you want to go in yet. But in our public accounting world, all right, audit, and tax, and consulting, um, those are the audit and the tax. Those are mandatory. Now, you might be surprised how much tax is consulting, probably 75% of it. But actually doing the returns and forms, so people got to have it. It's a commodity. And so they don't want to pay a lot of money for it. The consulting's a different way, and some of the tax planning's a little bit different. So anyway, keep that in the back of your mind, but that becomes important all semester, all forever. All right. And if you've got discretionary information, that can set you apart, your ability to be able to what I tell you? Provide that information that's relevant and that adds to the value. Now, sometimes, though, it becomes tough because for those of us on the mandatory end, we're going to always be there, right? We're never going to fire ourselves because we got to do those reports, those returns. All right. So now let's think about data. All right, kind of changing themes here a little bit. So this is kind of new, and what this is saying is, and this was one of the characteristics, but when it's readable, right? Remember, we got all this information. We could have what? Information overload. So this is when we're starting to get into the technology piece, is understanding that, hey, if the machine can read it, it becomes more valuable. And y'all have grown up in a time, remember, if you did my personal biography, I'm 63, man. And so when I first started, my first portable computer, and I had one when we first started, but it weighed 45 pounds, right? And you had to roll it out. It came out on rollers and a floppy drive. And when I would go audit, I would go look at reports that you go back in the room and they were printouts and they were this thick and there were hundreds of them. Accounts receivable, accounts payable, and it would take us forever to kind of go through them. We'd have to do a selective. But in today's world, machines do that work for you. We're going to understand that. That's a lot of what we're going to talk about in the system is understanding what the machine's doing, okay? We might not be technical experts in the middle, but we know the beginning. And for us, what's that? Every one of y'all can do what? Create an income statement. You know debits and credits on the left. You know, right? And so when we think about the income statement from financial accounting, that's what? That's what comes out on the other side. What goes in? You remember your transaction, debit and credit. Company A bought inventory from company B, and right, we record. That's what you do in intermediate one and financial. You record transactions. Once the transaction is recorded, you get a trial balance, and from that trial balance, you create the reports. What we're going to do in this class is figure out, hey, we're not worried about the beginning and the end. We're really concerned about what happens in the middle, where that information goes from taking those gazillion transactions. You think about Walmart, man. They got a gazillion transactions a year. We got to take all those transactions. We're going to produce these financial reports, and we've got to understand what's happening in the middle. Got it? Okay. All right. And so one of them now the SEC requires is XBRL. What does that do? And you'll hear this during the semester. It makes everything consistent, okay? So that means that company A is not using this product and company B is using it. Because if I'm the auditor or the SEC, I can't always read your information, right? You might send in a PDF or a Word document. Now, technology, right? You're not using PDF and Word. It's different types of software systems, different programs. But XBRL makes it consistent. It's just one type. So everybody's using the same thing, okay? And what does it do? Reliability, relevance, because everybody's using the same terminology. So everybody's calling it accounts receivable or they're different cash accounts. It's not cash payroll for somebody and then payroll cash for somebody else, right? It might sound simple, but it's a bigger deal than you think, okay? And then now it's accessible. So let's think about it, all right? remember, this is kind of an overview, so we've got some various topics, but now we're talking about, and this is what I said earlier, is understanding that information going through the system. So now we're talking about the quality. What is the quality? Hey, didn't we just see this a while ago? All right, comes up all the time. But hey, what helps us make better decisions? Man, I just got through doing my ethics class for last year, and the theme was here was the whole thing was making better decisions. Because if you make better decisions, you know what you're going to have in life? Fewer regrets. Better decisions, fewer regrets. Okay. How do you make better decisions? Comes with time and experience. All right. I've gotten pretty good at it because why? Wise, wisdom. Wisdom comes with years of experience. Okay. You're going to be the same thing. Things you're doing now. All right. Y'all, and listen, students in here in this class are at different levels, but we're going to get better at making decisions the more we do it and the more what? Confidence that you have. All right. So information value, stick with this. I'm sure on exams you'll hear this. You'll run across this many times. And what is that? Cost, benefit. Here's, and y'all make these decisions at the same time. Sometimes you do it with time. All right. I might assign you an exercise that's worth 3 points. We got 1,000 for the year, 3 points, and you're going, all right, cost benefit. Cost being for you being what? Time. So is the time that I'm going to spend worth the benefit of those 3 points? Your answer better be yes. All right, because they add up and add up and add up. But everybody agree? You with me? That's critical to everybody, okay? So that's information. What's the value of that information? Doesn't mean it's not good information, but we got to make sure that it's not too costly and there is a benefit, okay? Some information doesn't cost hardly anything, but it doesn't provide a benefit. So what are those? I could ask you a business process. We really started that out at the beginning is remember I mentioned, hey, when you went and bought this book for the class, what was the process? But if I gave you any business, let's do a restaurant, let's do a pizza restaurant, okay? So what's their business process? And we're going to talk about, we're going to see the value chain. Remember, these are things that if I locked you in a room and gave you 30 minutes before you could get out, and I'd say, hey, provide for me the business processes to run a pizza restaurant. Could every one of you do it? And the answer is what? Yes. All right. I mean, at the end of the day, if I'm Domino's, I got to get there. I got to open the door, got to order inventory. I got to stock that inventory. I'm going to take orders. I'm going to fill those orders. Okay. I got to hire personnel, payroll. So the process are all those structured activities, tasks. What's involved? People, machines, goals that we have as a business, profit. Now, you follow me? This is what we're doing this semester. We are looking at these processes. We've got to make sure that the business processes that are in place, all right, sometimes we will impact what those processes are. But even for the times that we don't, in this information system, what we're trying to make sure we do is that the information that's flowing through the process, remember the beginning, the transactions, and the information, the data, transactions is the data, the information that comes out on the other end, we got to make sure that information is accurate. And so we got to figure out what happens from the data, the beginning, to the end. And that's what we're doing, okay? And then we're going to also talk about at the end, making decisions and things. So that's an information system, those business processes. What's involved? The people, the organization, and the technology. And in the middle is the information system. Now, technically, the information system doesn't have to be technology and computer. It is, all right? But it's still all that information. So when you first take the class, even my first time to teach it, right? Because I'd never done it. I've been here, been around 60 years. And you're thinking, hey, this is a lot of, programs and systems and software. And that's not really what it is. Now, is it a part? Yes. We're not going to design them. We don't have to figure out all the programming. We do have to have some knowledge because what's the other thing? As accountants, we have to do what? Know a little bit about everything. Okay. All right. So transactional information, because I'm going to show you this, but we've got internal and external parties. That's going to always happen. Hey, FYI, as I kind of go through this, I'm at 25 minutes in. You've always got the ability, and I'll tell you in the, hopefully you saw it in the video before you took it, the operational of the whole class, stop and start, come back and watch. But it's not very practical for me to do 5 minutes here and 5 minutes there, because then it's really, this is one piece. Okay. This is one whole program that you can't really divide up. All right. I'm just saying, as I'm watching the clock, I'm in 25 minutes and I'm still going, man. And that's what class, hey, in class, this thing will take me an hour and 15. So for those online, be glad, hey, I'm not in class. All right. So the business transactions, we talked about what those were, right? Accounts receivable, accounts payable, cash. We know what all those are, goods and services. All right. We're going to process the transactions and then the give and get. Okay. And so we know what that is. So this is in your book. You'll see this. Now, remember, S&S at the very beginning, there's of every chapter, that's a company, and it's an integrative case. I can't remember who S&S, Sam and Susie or something like that. But, read that every chapter, and then you get to see what they did at the beginning and through the end. Anyway, so they're operating this business. All right. So here's their system. And it goes from the beginning. The two of them know nothing about accounting and a system. And you'll see all the way when you get to the end of the book, right, what they've learned, and they put in an ERP system and all this. All right. But nothing new here that you don't already know from financial accounting. All right. So what does a vendor do? I'll have a purchase order, right? I might want, some type of consulting or inventory. Let's just do manufacturing, right? So I'm Lowe's and I'm going to buy inventory from, whomever, Caterpillar or something. Hopefully not that big, but all right. So that's a purchase order, and they're going to provide me the services, right? So this is what? Give and get. I get an invoice and I send a payment, right? So what do we have? Y'all think about it in financial. Give and get is what? For every debit, there must be a credit. So listen, if we've got an accounts payable, the vendor must have a what? Accounts receivable. If I've got an accounts receivable, my client must have a accounts payable. All right. If I've got a loan, what am I going to give back? I got a loan. I'm giving what? Loan payments, financial statements. Bank, I make a deposit, and then what would I take? Withdrawals, bank statements, right? So these are all transactions. Y'all are all comfortable with that. Now, so that's big picture, okay? I mean, so this is the system, internal and external, all right? And this is what system? Accounting, right? There's a bigger system, but that's that accounting system. And the accounting information system, I found this slide somewhere and I liked it because this is what an ERP system. We'll go through what ERP systems are a little bit later. There's three big ones, SAP and Oracle. Microsoft Dynamics is obviously big. I'm just not that familiar with it. I'm familiar with SAP and Oracle. All right. And so what happens is we've got financial, we've got cost, we've got tax, we've got audit. And so this information kind of a give and get, right? And so what I need is instead of four different software packages, ERP gives me one. All right. And we'll learn a little bit more about that. That's a big deal. All right. So let's go back to the business process. Okay. So if we've seen the different types, but for us, and we're going to do this we're going to really get into this in exam 4, right? I've broken the material up into 4 exams in 4 sections. So we're going to talk about this really at the end, and we'll go through. And what we're worried about, I don't know if worried is a word as much as I would say what we're concerned about. We're going to look at each of those cycles, and this is really an internal control, right? You'll do this in internal audit, which is what you're having. This is why this is a prereq for internal audit, is we're going to look here, right? We're going to look at internal controls, because we got to make sure, you remember what I tell you, we got to make sure that the inputs and then what happened in the middle for the outputs is happening the way we think they're happening, going through that computer system. And so we're going to look at all 5 of these cycles. All right. So it's 5 different chapters, 18, 17, 16, 15, 14, I think. But that'll be the last section. That'll actually be our final exam. Will cover these topics. All right. It won't be comprehensive, but it'll be on these processes. You'll be good for that. You'll be good at this, right? This is accounting. So those are things you should understand, and we know the business process. And so we'll dive into this a little bit deeper, right? There they are: revenue, production, right? Production, revenue, the GL, expenditure, finance, HR. All right. Give and take, okay? And those are the subsystems. This is what we're gonna master. I use that term loosely, all right? But you're gonna attempt to master this by the end of the semester. But I gotta know a lot of other little things in order to be able to do that. So that's why we're gonna finish with that. All right, so AI, so the accounting collects, all right? So we should be good by this now, okay? Collects, records, stores, processes data. And what are we trying to do? So that's kind of a summary of what we've been talking about. Accounting, we know what accounting is: systematic, comprehensive recording of financial transactions. So by definition, accounting is an information system that allows for decision making. And we do that in cost. All right, if you don't hear this in your cost class, I will tell you this. You go look for a job and you look for a cost accounting job, and you're probably not going to find one, all right? Because you know what's happened? They changed the name. They call it financial analyst. So go into LinkedIn. If you're curious, go into LinkedIn and put in financial analyst or senior financial analyst - accounting, and you know what's going to pop up? Cost accounting jobs, all right? What are those jobs? A lot of things on budgeting and information, but the key to them is making sure that we're providing information for decision making. Okay, so there's just so many different areas in accounting. It's not just financial, it's not just audit, or it's just not tax. There's just so many different areas. Okay, really makes it interesting. All right. All right. So what's the process? Data. There's the system and information. We've talked about that a lot. Okay, and then a user is going to do what? Make a decision. So I've said this the whole time we've been in this video. So what are the key components, okay, for this? Well, obviously I need people. Okay, we got to know what the procedures are. We've obviously talked about data. All right, now we're going to have software. So we're going to get into, this is technology. We're going to get into that. And remember, we're going to finish with internal controls. Internal controls is the key, okay? Not sexy, but it's the key. Now, here's what happens. When you understand the internal controls, you know what that means? You understand how that business operates. And that's what we all want to do. I want you to graduate and be able to say, hey, I understand how that business operates. Now, here's the cool thing is when we talk about a business operating, I don't care if it's Walmart, if it's IBM, if it's Tesla, if it's Amazon, they all operate the same. Guess what? They all have what? Cash, accounts receivable, inventory, supplies, equipment, computer, accounts payable, notes payable. All right. Now, the only 2 areas that are a little bit different: financial institution, banks. They got their cash on the wrong side of their assets. All right. So, because if the bank has cash, it's my cash, so it's a liability to them, right? And the medical profession, all right, they're a little bit different because Medicare, Medicaid, how they collect, what they write off. So those 2 are a little bit different. But 80% of businesses, service, merchandising, manufacturing, they're all the same. Okay. All right. So how do we add value? That's the key. Because look, if I'm not adding value, I'm disposable. Right? Is in a tough time with businesses cutting back, I got to make sure that I'm adding value. Or which what did we call a while ago? We called this discretionary. Now, not a lot of technology discretionary, right? And so if I'm not adding value, I better be at least mandatory. Okay. So how can we add value? Improving quality, efficiency, sharing knowledge. This is in here twice, right? No, this is efficiency and effectiveness of the supply chain. All right. Internal control, big deal, right? Decision making, biggest deal. So these are two things that are going to come from an AI. All right. So a couple of things. If we have an AI system, what are we going to do? We're going to use AI. All right. We'll get into that this semester. We'll talk about what it looks like. We use it in business, education, finance, and healthcare. I use it in this class some. We'll talk about AI, how you use it, when it becomes important. Um, Data analytics is something else we use. All right. We're going to have the exam 2 material is all data analytics. Important for your what? Career. Remember that. Okay. All right. So my son graduated. I told you all that. He worked a little over 3.5 years in public with EY. Now he's over in industry, and man, he is doing this every day. He's a senior financial analyst. Uh, So data analytics, we'll get into all of that, identifying a problem or issue to resolve. We collect the data and we're going to make some decisions. This is pretty cool. That's really what our specialty in accounting, kind of that accounting finance piece for us. All right. This is, we'll do this chapter 12, maybe somewhere in there. We'll talk about blockchain, not in a lot of depth, but enough that you're knowledgeable, right? I don't want you to be out in the workforce, graduated, and say, no, we never talked about blockchain. We'll understand what it works, all right? It will not be our responsibility to go in and try to explain it. It's over my head, all right? But I know enough about what some of the advantages. It's a chain, right? So there's blocks of information, and they're chained together. So once I input data here, you can't go backwards. It's confusing. All right, I'll just tell you that. Okay, but we'll talk about what that chain looks like. Okay, we'll do that. I'm pretty sure it's chapter 12. All right, and these are things we talk about. We'll also get into cloud computing. That's actually when you're on Canvas, you're watching this. This video is up in the cloud, right? We probably already know that. All right. Virtualization, that means I can run a lot of different systems at the same time. Internet of Things, that's everything, right? Turn on the lights. I walk in a room and my lights automatically come on, sensors, the software, the technology. So we've heard that term for a while. Hey, I will tell you this is the cloud computing piece. This is an example the book uses. Probably not as easy to follow, so it doesn't really, you don't have to figure this out. But it's kind of like eating pizza, and they're just trying to tell you that if you dine out, all right, so the red is the traditional kind, right? So, all right, if I'm at home and I make my pizza from scratch, what do I need? I need a table, something to drink, electricity, oven, dough, and toppings, okay? All right, now, if I get some information, I take it home and bake. Okay, what am I still going to need? I'm going to need the dough and the toppings, and this is being supplied to me. All right, pizza's delivered. Okay, I don't need what? All right, I've got the delivery. I've got the table and the soda. All right, and I don't need those anymore. Okay. The take and bake I don't need. All right. Software, all of these are supplied. And so it just kind of gives you an idea. I can't think I'll ever ask you this question again to know the difference between those three. So when you read it, but it's just to let you know that, right, that the idea becomes, like, for instance, am I using just one software? Okay, so now when I go, right now I'm working on my Surface Pro tablet, and I'm in PowerPoint, and I've got one subscription to PowerPoint. If I'm at home on my computer, or if I'm in the office, which is over here, that computer, I use the tablet because I can draw and write on it much easier. It's all the same. It's all the same copy of PowerPoint. All right, it's the exact same one. Okay, so that's sharing software, right? But if I've got a different service, okay, and that would be the cloud that's hosting everything, and maybe I've got 4 different places that it's located. And so those are kind of the infrastructure pieces. So there's just so many different things to the cloud. And that for us in here is not a big concern, except when we talk about internal controls. All right. And this is there's actually 4 or 5 chapters at the end. We're not going to have enough time to study that, but we want to know that corporate has a strategy, making money, making a profit, whatever that is. And AIS is a big part of that. And we'll talk a little bit about it in each chapter, but we won't get a chance to focus on, how do we go out and put in this new AIS system, what that would look like from the beginning to the end, all right? Buying it, making those decisions, all right? We're just going to learn what one is and how it works. But if I was designing it, what would it do? The culture, my strategy, what we want it to accomplish. I really wanted to spend the 3 chapters. I think it's very interesting because it's your decision making. So we get to the semester, I'll talk a little bit about it, but we're not going to really be able to cover it in depth. All right, so this is the value chain we were talking about earlier. Links together a lot of information, primary and support. Let's see if I get a picture of it. All right, so this is the best picture. So think about primary activities. Inbound, I'm ordering inventory. All right, so I'm Walmart. I order inventory. The operations are what? I take them off the shelf, or I take them off the truck. They're in the warehouse. I move them out of the warehouse into the facility, and then what else happens? People come in, I buy, we sell, the cash rests, right? So that's my business operations. Outbound is then, hey, that's once the customer gets it, they walk out of the house with it, or if I'm actually the manufacturer, right? I'm shipping it somewhere if I'm an online. And then I've always got marketing and sales because I'm trying to get customers in. And then I've got to service them if they're refunds, returns, different businesses, right? Different manufacturing or, retail. I'm probably not going to service a lot of it, but I'm going to have a lot of this. Okay. Now the infrastructure is what? HR. I've got to process payroll. I've got to have that information system. I got to have accounting. I got to have the CEO and the controller, right? That's the support activities. And you remember that from cost. So what is supply chain? Well, that's how the materials come in and get to the consumer. That's the supply chain. We're not a supply chain class, but we do have to understand this, okay? So what's our role? Well, we can't be every one of these roles. Everybody good? You're not going to be in every one of these roles. You could be a designer. That's not very many of our skill set. There might be 1 or 2 of you that's the designer, all right? But a lot of us are going to be the user or the manager or the evaluator, or maybe even the implementer, okay? You're the administrator overseeing it. And so, but we could be in all of these roles, okay? So think of that as we kind of go through the semester, all right? Okay. Hey, I got under 45 minutes. I can promise you that's an hour and 15 in class. All right. See you on the next video.